A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
President Obama said last year the use of chemical weapons by the Syrian army would be a red line, but now that it appears they may have used them, it's unclear what's next. David Ignatius joins us, who's just back from the region. You were in Israel last week?
Yes, I was in Israel, talked to many of their leading generals, security analysts.
And Israel says this happened, Britain and France says this happened. Are we really not sure?
I think we don't have the kind of evidence yet that we'd feel comfortable taking to the United Nations and taking on television. I think also the president is looking for some time before he has to act. But I do think the name of the game now is having the sort of convincing, dispositive, there's no question about it, evidence. And that's partly because this is a White House that fears being compared to the Bush administration and its rush to war against Iraq.
There also seems to be the possibility that they don't want that red line to have been crossed because they don't want to have to do what is implicit in saying you cross a red line, I do X.
I think the administration is genuinely uncertain about what to do. President Obama from the beginning has felt that getting deeply involved in the war in Syria is a mistake. He understands that he was reelected in part because he said to a war-weary country, we're not going to do this again. And so the notion that a few months into his second term he would enter an open-ended commitment in Syria, very uncertain one, really bothers him and others in the White House. The president has moved towards a more substantial, I'll just call it a covert action program, a program to train and assist the Syrian rebels that's basically being run out of Jordan, that's going to provide them with increasingly heavy-duty stuff. They're going to get armor, they're going to get night vision goggles. Other people are supplying them the guns to shoot at night with our wink and nod. So the U.S. is getting in deeper. Dealing with the chemical weapons is a much different order of magnitude. That's a big military operation, and it still scares the White House.
If they become convinced that this quote-unquote red line is crossed, what is the involvement? What does that look like beyond what we're already doing?
Obviously, that's the kind of question that a journalist doesn't fully understand, but here's some of the options that I've heard people discuss. First, you could go after the chemical weapons capabilities themselves, but that's tricky. You don't want to, with an explosion, create the very chemical disaster that you're seeking to prevent. But these are binary weapons, so it's possible that there could be a military strike. So the Syrian chemical weapons program has a number of research facilities. Those would also be obvious targets. There are special units that have been involved in the bloodiest attacks against civilians. And you could say that we're not going to attack the chemical weapons program directly, but we're going to attack the things that are menacing the Syrian population. So you could go after Special Republican Guard units, you could go after Shabiha headquarters. Those are the kind of militia-like groups that have been attacking civilian targets.
Maybe the hardest question, in a way, it's the most important. Do we have any sense where in the arc of this drama we are? Are we getting any closer to a conclusion, or it just continues on and on?
The answer to that lies perhaps paradoxically in Moscow. If Russian President Vladimir Putin were to decide tomorrow, this conflict has gone on long enough, the Syrians have crossed not just America's red line in using chemical weapons, but Russia's red line, and he has reason to say that because the Russians have privately warned against this. The Russians could intervene and broker a transition from the regime of Bashar al-Assad, and the big open phase of the war, I think, would end fairly quickly. Absent that, this is going to go on, I hear people talk about a year or two, and by people I mean senior analysts in the U.S. and other governments. So a year or two more fighting is going to leave Syria, frankly, a failed state. It's going to leave it in ruins physically, but also in terms of its governance structure. And then putting that back together, when you have a very strong al-Qaeda presence on the shores of the Mediterranean, at the gates of Europe, that's a big problem that lies ahead.
Okay. David, good talking to you. Good to have you back on the show.
Great, thanks.